a group of lawyers in Northern California, several of them had worked for the Reagan administration in California, saw that these liberal legal organizations were proliferating and having a great effect on the law. They were successfully taking cases up to the U.S. Supreme Court and advancing the law in a manner that advanced their beliefs. Well, these lawyers said, hey, nobody is speaking to our core values. Nobody is advancing the causes of individual rights and liberty. So these attorneys in Sacramento formed the Pacific Legal Foundation and almost immediately started taking cases to the U.S. Supreme Court and started winning against all odds. If you think back to the early 70s, it was a very progressive period. That conservative values were being really downtrodden, almost as much as they are currently. But over the years, Pacific Legal Foundation grew its reputation on being a champion for property rights and individual rights and responsible environmental regulation. This is where PLF steps in. We had supported the Commerce Clause arguments, but when Justice Roberts characterized it and joined the dissent and characterized it as a tax, he said, wait a minute. If y'all recall the sort of nightmare of how this program got pushed through without really robust debate and getting into the details and making a law that might actually work. Anyone who's looked at their premiums for next year knows this law doesn't work. They used a parliamentary trick called a shell bill, where there was a bill that was making its way to the Senate that passed the House by a wide majority. It was about providing housing tax benefits to returning veterans of war. Who would vote against that? So what happens is it gets over, the House approves it, they push it on, it goes to the Senate, and suddenly the text of this bill that was meant to aid returning veterans is deleted and replaced with Obamacare. And on it is stamped, approved by the House. So all they needed, if you recall, at this point, the House had a Republican majority, and then the Senate had a Democrat majority. The Democrats said, oh yeah, stamp, it's the law. Anyway, that case is called California Building Industry Association v. City of San Jose. It has, if it is taken by the Supreme Court, and this has a lot of support right now, and so we're hoping we'll hear in December, if it is taken by the Supreme Court, it has the potential of setting a incredibly essential legal precedent for everybody in this room that would say that in these permit situations, if they're going to condition your right to use your property upon a dedication of land or property interest to the government, that it must show first that the dedication is related to some adverse impact caused by your development. So if you're building a driveway, they have to show that it's going to increase the stormwater runoff. They can't just say that any development will have an impact on stormwater runoff. They have to show it. And second, and this is the most important part is the proportionality problem, that they have to show that the size of the buffer, if they want a 300-foot buffer, they need to show that that is necessary to mitigate for the stormwater. They can't just say that just because you're going to have an adverse impact, you can take anything you want. So keep your eyes open in December to see if this case goes up, because currently in Washington, they're not following that rule. If we get a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court, they will be compelled to follow that rule. And all of you will be more secure in your property, because I tell you, that's what Kitsap wants to do. You heard earlier about Kitsap County, this Title II and warrantless searches. I recently looked at the Title II of the Kitsap County Code, and it authorizes, although we don't know of any actual incidents of it occurring, but it authorizes the planning department to search your property without warrants to see if there's any unpermitted or any uses of the land that's not up to code in order to take action against you. Well, in Washington, we have a heightened constitutional right of privacy. We have the most protective privacy right in the entire United States. Of course, as we know, just as a brief aside, the Soviet Constitution had a right to private property. That these rights are only as strong as the government's will to enforce them. That's the only reason I point that out. PLF recently brought a case against the city of Seattle trying to uphold this right of privacy. The constitutional provision says that government shall not interfere with private affairs of individuals without due process or due process of law, which basically means obtaining a warrant or some sort of legal decision that there's enough cause for government to enter your property. And the city of Seattle last year adopted, or earlier this year, adopted a law to enforce, well, let me back up. The city of Seattle has one of the highest recycling and composting rates in the entire nation. At something like, I believe it was like 70% of compostable materials and recyclable materials are diverted from garbage. Well, that's not enough. The city of Seattle wants to be the best in the nation, not one of the best. So they said, well, voluntary compliance is only making us one of the best. What if we make this compulsory? That's always the best way to get people to comply, isn't it? So they come up with this they come up with this idea. Gotta edit myself, this is on film. We can take that out later, right? Okay. They come up with this wise decision that, well, they already have garbage collectors going out and they're opening up your waste bins. So they kind of know what's going on in there. So why don't we slap a silver star on their chest and tell them that they're now deputies and their job is going to be to dig through your garbage. And then we'll find out who is throwing away their old red velvet cake, who is throwing away the chicken bones. And those people will be shamed. They're going to have a giant red tag slapped on their can, because we know that public shaming is awesome. It works with the stockades. It will work in Seattle. And if these people are shameless, as we know people who throw away chicken bones are. Yeah, you throw away chicken bones? Anyway, no, okay, sorry. I'm not going to go with the city of Seattle. If they do, then we're going to fine them. And we're going to continue to fine them, and maybe even cut off their garbage collection service, which actually would not solve the problem, but that's okay. What's that?
It's mandatory.
It is mandatory, yes. Okay, so we've got this right to privacy, and yet we're deputizing garbage collectors to go through your garbage cans to see what's there. There's a problem here, isn't there? Well, there is. In the 80s, there was this great case. We used to have this wonderful Washington Supreme Court that was very, for all their liberal tendencies, they were very libertarian. They were very supportive of individual rights. And so we have this great body of case law from like the 80s into the early 90s out of the Washington Supreme Court that even rejected a U.S. Supreme Court that said that, that you have no privacy rights in your garbage, yada, yada, yada. In Washington, the police were they suspected that this fellow was making drugs in his house. They didn't have enough probable cause to execute a search warrant, so they decided, why don't we just go through his garbage? Because evidence of your life is in your garbage. Every paparazzi knows that. You can reconstruct the most embarrassing and private facts about a person by going through their garbage. So the police did that. They built up enough evidence to eventually bring criminal charges against the homeowner. Well, the case made its way up to the Washington Supreme Court, and Washington Supreme Court said, no, you cannot. This conviction has to be overturned because you had no right to search through this person's garbage. That the expectation that the government would pick up and dispose of the garbage did not open it up to having the garbage searched for possible evidence of violating the law. You need to have enough information to get a warrant. Now let's fast forward again back to last year when Seattle adopted this garbage inspection law. What they have done is they've deputized every trash collector to search your property upon the suspicion that every single person could be violating this law that they just created. Well, PLF filed a lawsuit against that, and we're currently in the discovery process. In that, we found documents instructing the garbage collectors to do things like, lift bags, and if they're not tied, then open them up and look in them. If they're transparent, to look in them to see what's in them. If they're torn, you can exploit the tear to see what's in them. A garbage collector interview with NPR was bragging about how like 1 out of every 3 homes he's citing for violations of this law. Well, we say it's unconstitutional. We're hoping to have a trial by next year, and if this case is successful, it's kind of funny because it talks about garbage, and pretty much every headline we've received has had a wonderful pun in it because it sets itself up. But if we win this case, it will secure the property, the property rights of citizens across this nation, especially in counties like Kitsap, where there is a law on the books that allows code enforcement officers to peek over your fence or open up your gate and go in and look to see if maybe you built a deck on the back of your house, or maybe you laid some concrete without their permission. That it would make that per se unconstitutional for them to do that, and they would have to follow the legal channels of getting judicial permission before they enter your property.